No, you haven't clicked on the wrong video, this is Dark Ages again for the moment, because I wanted to mention that quite a lot has happened since I started this video series. In the large gap between my covering 1996 and 1997, the anthology has been released on Steam in addition to the standalone version that was available before. The Steam release has a couple of differences. The id Software games, Commander Keen and Wolfenstein 3D, don't make an appearance because they're already on Steam as self-published by id. To make up for that, 3D Realms added a few titles I've already gone over, which will eventually make it back to the standalone version of the anthology as well. These games are Dark Ages and Xenophage, should you want it, along with a 1997 game that I'll cover in this video. I don't think there are any other major differences, though the Steam version of Death Rally is the Windows release, and the other games use a different, more modern branch of DOSBox and some adjusted settings to make a few of the titles run more smoothly. However, this couldn't save Xenophage, which still kept crashing all the time for me. The Apogee name had now been retired and the team continued releasing games under the new banner of 3D Realms, although the number of in-house titles they produced was severely reduced since the early 90s, and the anthology includes only 3 games released over the next 5 years. Firstly, in May 1997, having explored brave new frontiers in the field of sexism with the Duke Nukem character, they decided to have a go at racism as well with the release of Shadow Warrior. As you can tell just by looking at it, this is another game based on the build engine. This time Ken Silverman added some enhancements, including supports for voxel-based objects. Until the early 2000s, the build engine was reputedly the most widely used platform for commercial games, with 12 titles using it, until it was superseded by the various iterations of the Unreal Engine, which together have about a bazillion. The setting this time is in an amalgamation of China, Japan and other Eastern countries that was made up by people who had never set foot there, but had watched a few Bruce Lee films. This time, our protagonist, who in a decision that sets the tone we're going to get from this game is named Lo Wang, was a bodyguard for the megacorporation Zilla Enterprises until he raised ethical concerns over the president's plan to conquer China-Japan using creatures summoned from another dimension. A short while after resigning, Mr. Wang is minding his own business in his dojo of death when a troop of these creatures sent after him burst in through the window, and from then on his journey takes him through the city and beyond, beating up the invaders on his way to confront the president himself. As you would expect, the game plays very much like Duke Nukem 3D. You run around environments collecting more heavy weapons than anyone with fewer than 18 arms could possibly carry at a time, and using them to blast the onslaught of enemies. Once again, one-liners from your character are included during moments of intense carnage, this time with speech in a very, very dodgy Chinese accent provided by a very, very white man called John William Galt.
Row your boat gently down to the stream. Whoa, I think my dinghy hanging out.
Thankfully you can turn this off, but I have to admit some of the lines are funny, so it's a stream about the racist accent. Listen to his reaction when you accidentally step on a set of your own caltrops after deploying them.
Who put these here? Ow!
Those caltrops are one of the items that you can stock up on in your inventory to use later, again much like Duke's outing. This time you get some stealth-themed weapons, gas bombs which continuously hurt enemies or players nearby, flash grenades to blind them temporarily, and so on. There's also a slot for a repair kit which you can use on certain pieces of machinery in the levels, like this drivable forklift truck which you can utilise as a platform to reach a higher area. There are plenty of other examples of interactivity that were impressive for a first-person shooter of the time. Early on you encounter this remote control racetrack and have to find your way into the security cupboard so that you can pilot the vehicle with the key on it out to where you can grab it. A lot of the selectable weapons have unusual features that make them stand out from other first-person shooters as well, and not just for their martial arts film flavouring. As your most basic method of dealing damage, you've got your Kung Fu master bare hands, and you can pick up a katana which makes short work of most enemies if you can get them into range, although irritatingly if you run out of ammunition the game always defaults to the fists, and you have to select your sword manually. The first projectile weapon is your throwing stars or shuriken. You throw 3 at a time, making the ammunition count on the status bar deceptively large, but you can actually retrieve these and use them again if they embed themselves in walls. At the high end of the scale, Lo Wang can improvise by picking up the head of the particular enemy and using its laser vision to burn through further monsters. And on the zero key you have a supply of Ripper Hearts, which aren't really weapons, but when you use them you summon a ghost version of yourself to fight alongside you. At least I'm assuming that's the intention. Whenever I tried it, my clone mostly just stood around confused before spontaneously exploding. Many of the weapons can be used in multiple ways, changing fire modes by hitting the weapon number key a second time after selecting them. The riot gun, this game's equivalent of a shotgun, can be set to fire 4 rounds in rapid succession when you're dealing with tough single enemies. And not to be outdone, this missile launcher has 3 different modes: standard missiles of death, heat-seeking mode if you've picked up the necessary enhancement, or the literal nuclear option of firing a warhead after several seconds of warm-up time, although I was unable to find a use for this that didn't involve blowing myself up along with everything else in a 20-mile radius. And that brings me to something else I couldn't help noticing. To this game, balance just means something that you have to do in your kung fu lessons between the interesting bits. Even on the easiest setting, both you and your enemies are absurdly overpowered, and neither of these facts works in your favour. Every attack can take off a massive portion of your health, often before you've even seen the enemy, and the explosive weapons make it ridiculously easy to take yourself out by accident in the surprisingly wide blasts they produce. There's an enemy that appears quite a lot that runs towards you brandishing a high explosive and can take off virtually all your health instantly, and even once you've dealt with them, they have a chance of rising from their grave for revenge. So I'm not sure if it's just me going soft in my old age, but as far as I'm concerned, you're going to have to make frequent use of the quick load and save menus to get through the hordes, taking as little damage as possible to save up your life bar. Shadow Warrior is a fairly short game by 3D Realms standards. It has only 2 episodes, the shareware version, which is 4 levels long, and the registered game, which has a further 18. Like Rise of the Triad, no levels from the shareware episode are repeated in the registered one, although this compilation gives you the shareware and registered versions on the menu to select from. If you explore around the menus, you'll also find the novel concept of a kid mode, which purports to remove the offensive content. It has to be said it doesn't do a fantastic job of that, because the attempt at a Chinese accent, obviously voiced by a Texan while stretching his eyes sideways and wearing a lampshade on his head, remains unaffected. In practice, what the option does is to remove the blood from the weapon sprites and makes enemies vanish into thin air instead of falling over in about 12 bits, which is mostly just confusing in intense situations as you can't tell if they suddenly move behind you. Relatedly, a special version of the game had to be created for the UK because shuriken were among the completely arbitrary collection of weapons that weren't allowed to be depicted in entertainment there at the time, and so the second weapon was replaced with darts instead. Why including a delicately fashioned specialist throwing weapon wasn't alright, but showing Lo Wang hurling around easily concealed sharp things that you could find embedded in the walls of any pub in the country was acceptable, I really can't say. Like Duke Nukem 3D, a source port of Shadow Warrior is available. A copy of John O.F.'s Shadow Warrior port is included in the Steam version and can be downloaded for free from its author's site below if you have the standalone one. The Steam release provides it as an option labelled experimental, but it seems to work well enough. It does much the same as the Duke Nukem 3D port, adding support for higher resolutions and more comfortable use of the mouse and so on. Crucially, it also allows you to redefine the controls, which is an option I couldn't find in the original game. At the time, its placing of jump and crouch on the A and Z keys and using space for the action button wouldn't have been too out of the ordinary, but it feels uncomfortable and backwards today. So especially with those enhancements, and even though you will never cringe harder than at the cod Chinese voice or the relentless jokes centred around the main character's name being Wang, this is an interesting addition to 3D Realms' lineup. Shadow Warrior also has the rather dubious and unlikely honour of having a bonus pack that was delayed for 8 years after the release of the game because somebody physically lost it. Wanton Destruction, a set of 12 levels in new environments developed by a company called Sunstorm, was completed shortly after Shadow Warrior came out, but their distributor decided to delay its release until sales of the game picked up. Shortly afterwards, the company went out of business and sold all its software off to various places, and 3D Realms attempted to find where the bonus pack had got to, but eventually had to give up. Things went silent until 2005 when Sunstorm's former president suddenly found the completed pack on an archive CD lying in the bottom of a drawer somewhere, and Wanton Destruction was finally released as a free add-on. This isn't included in the anthology, but you can download it from ModDB and probably a lot of other places as well.
This is a great day for science.
I mentioned in the previous video that the idea when Apogee started branding themselves as 3D Realms was to release games under different company names depending on the genre. That had been the plan when they first started the approach, but what actually happened was that they used the 3D Realms name for all their games after 1996 with only one exception. Balls of Steel was developed by another Australian software house called Wildfire Studios and was published by Apogee under the name Pinball Wizards. Here they made further advances to their new approach in the taste department by releasing some promotional artwork showing a large pair of pinballs being cupped by a female hand above the tagline, "Come play with our balls." I don't really know a thing about pinball games, so I'm going to stick to the facts first of all. You have a choice of 5 tables of various themes, and you can select between them in a hideous looking Windows 95 style launcher window where you can look at the theme, details or high scores of each one. Each table has its own set of special rules and objectives, briefly touched on in this window and gone over more comprehensively in the game's help file. I honestly don't think I've ever played regular pinball, and all of what these describe might as well be in Martian for all I understand them, but by looking up a glossary of pinball terms I was able to just about hold myself together. Darkside is the table that came with the game's shareware version and is themed around repelling alien invaders from a spacecraft. This translates to gameplay as having to hit a particular target to activate different missions, rather incompatible with my pinball tactic of desperately bashing the flippers and hoping for the best. On each table there's a dot matrix display at the bottom that relentlessly shouts things at you like hit the egg shoot or spin flibbertigibbets to light targets, which are things that I can never quite reconcile with what anything in the game's instructions is telling me about the objective of the table.
Your choice, sir.
Mutation is the table that I had by far the most success with, keeping going for 20 minutes, though I'm not sure if that was due to any amount of skill on my part or if my flailing tactics are particularly suited to this kind of layout. This one has the idea of a mutant breakout in an underground lab somewhere, which is apparently headed by the Simpsons' Mr. Burns.
Ooh, the beast is hungry.
Here the game starts taking advantage of its computer-based nature and getting into things that you can't do on a normal table. One of the mini-games is called Capture the Spores and involves a heap of beige balls being released onto the table that burst messily against the surface if you don't flip them into the requisite buckets fast enough. When multiple balls are in play, the view changes to show a zoomed-out view of the complete table so that you can track what's going on, though you can lock the display to either the scrolling zoomed view or the complete table view in the game's options. Neither of these views are absolutely ideal because in the scrolling view you can't see up the table to where you're aiming without pausing the game and scrolling up manually first, and the full table view makes everything display a bit on the small side, so it's really up to your own preference and how comprehensively you've memorised the table. The other tables work along similar lines, each with a unique layout of flippers and obstacles. There's Firestorm, which is a sort of US Emergency Services themed table with burning skyscrapers and car chases, Barbarian, which is more power metal and sends you on imaginary quests involving the 4 elements, dragons and magic gems, and finally the Duke Nukem table with a remade version of the theme music and a voice provided once again by Johnson 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 John. In a display of more confidence in me than I frankly think I deserve, each table's objectives keep implying that I have any agency in where I'm actually hitting these things rather than just desperately trying to keep up with where the ball is and hoping it stays above the gutter at the bottom of the playfield, but perhaps more experienced players of the genre will better understand what they're dealing with here. There's also a 6th table that was originally planned but was abandoned in favour of doing the Duke Nukem table at the time. This one was later released as a standalone game called Devil's Island. You can get this last table from Wildfire's site, which shockingly still works. They're now making mobile games which are all the same games as the one developed by every other mobile game studio. You're able to play each table on a selection of difficulty settings. The normal one gives you 5 balls, and the novice setting does the same but keeps a ball saver on for several minutes after the start of the game so that you don't actually lose any lives for a while. Above that, there's arcade mode, which reduces your number of balls to 3, and then tournament mode, which isn't really a difficulty setting but an option to make any random elements on the tables deterministic so that you can more fairly compare scores. In fact, the game originally had a feature that allowed you to upload your scores to a central server and compare them with players all over the world, like an infinitely less moronic Xbox Live community, though this service has long since been discontinued. Balls of Steel runs a bit shakily under the most recent version of Windows as it uses an outdated graphics library that has a chance of not working at all with some graphics cards. My computer handled it but displayed the dot matrix scoreboard badly and was locked to full screen. However, the Steam release includes an alternative launcher written by Christophe Thibault, if I can hope for a moment that I'm pronouncing that name remotely correctly. This isn't a source port like I mentioned before, but it sits in between the game and the graphics routines and allows Windows 7 to handle them a bit better, producing a window that behaves itself in both full screen and windowed modes. Oddly, this isn't the default option for launching despite being incontrovertibly better, and you have to run it by selecting compatibility mode when you start the game through Steam. In conclusion, this is a pinball game. I don't want you to think I'm copping out now that I'm almost at the end of the series, but I genuinely cannot say anything intelligent about it, other than that 5 tables is probably a good number and the ball physics seem to hold together well. If you like pinball and don't mind playing a simulation on a computer, you might like this, but if you don't, I doubt it'll change your mind and will probably leave you slightly confused.
It's clobbering time.
The final game in the anthology is Duke Nukem Manhattan Project, giving him a total of 4 games in the collection. This one was released in 2002, 5 years after the next most recent game, and you can definitely recognise the leap in technology that PC games went through over that period. Uniquely among the anthology, this game is fully polygonal. The game window's title bar gives away that it was written in the Prism 3D engine by SCS Software, which is still in use today, mostly to make boring simulation games about driving trucks around. Manhattan Project is a side-scrolling run-and-gun game, and shares a name and storyline with one of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles games. This time, our favourite blonde flat-topped refrigeration unit is called in to rescue Manhattan Island, where a mad scientist is spreading a radioactive substance to mutate creatures into flesh-hungry monsters. Duke has to make his way through various city environments, blasting at mutant pigs, cockroaches, kung fu crocodiles and so on, rescuing everybody and generally saving the day. This time, the game was developed by Sunstorm Interactive, who wrote the almost non-appealing expansion for Shadow Warrior that I mentioned earlier, and it was published by a company called Arush Entertainment, with 3D Realms acting only as the producer. Rather nicely to round off the anthology, this has the look of a later three-dimensional game while recalling the side-scrolling platformers that Apogee used to be famous for, the next most recent of which was Realms of Chaos in 1995. The controls are straightforward and unpretentious. You can walk from left to right, jump, which feels a bit floaty at first but you soon get used to it, and fire your weapon into the baddies, with shortcut buttons for kicking and using your remote triggerable pipe bombs. It's what now would be termed a 2.5-dimensional game. Everything is drawn in 3D, but the action always takes place on a 2D line, with occasional opportunities to switch between planes or turn corners. For the most part, this style of gameplay works very well, although it can throw up some odd moments where you wonder why the muscle-bound idiot doesn't just f***ing walk around a barrier rather than have to find an alternative route. The available weapons are generally pretty straightforward. You have your pistol, shotgun, assault rifle and rocket launcher, which all behave much as you would expect. In an interesting touch, some enemies fire glowing green radioactive mutant stuff, which can cause nearby wandering creatures like rats or insects to transform into more enemies if it touches them, and you can also find a ray gun to reverse this process later in the game. In a wonderful bit of self-awareness, Duke's stamina is represented by his ego on the bottom of the screen, which you have to make sure can be seen from outer space at all times. When he gets wounded, shot or set on fire, he takes an understandable hit to it, and when it reaches zero, he collapses and goes home to sulk. It can be restored not just by pickups, but by defeating enemies as well, giving you more of an incentive to stand and fight rather than avoid them. And if you can get his ego to truly Simon Cowell levels, you get a power boost that allows you to deal double damage for a while. Just like in Duke Nukem 3D, Duke's personality is also evident in his voice samples throughout the game. He punctuates shooting enemies or collecting things by spouting various quotes stolen from films, some of which would make even Rainer Wolfcastle cringe. Although to be fair, it sort of suits Duke that he would have got his persona from watching far too many American action films. I do enjoy his reaction when he comes across a piece of machinery that isn't working or a door that you don't yet have the key for.
Keycards.
For the most part, levels follow the pattern of having to find a keycard, either lying around or by getting it from a certain enemy, then reaching the exit, rescuing a damsel in distress from a slime bomb along the way, and exchanging single entendres with them. To make things interesting, there are also secrets scattered around the environment, some of which take some imagination to find. Each level also contains 10 hexagonal pickups called nukes, and if you collect them all throughout the game, you're rewarded with an unlocked power-up at the end. Most of the levels contain a few unique obstacles and set pieces to break up the platforming, such as dodging tunnel supports while riding on the back of a train or navigating a toxin-polluted river. There's also a boss every 3 levels, although they seem to spend all their available time on the first multi-stage helicopter boss, which you eventually have to take out while clinging to a ladder on its underside. The ones in the next few levels are rather less involved or impressive. The worst moment I experienced was this part where you have to navigate a 2-lane road while cars drive obliviously by, and will make Duke suddenly disintegrate at the slightest touch rather than the more realistic outcome of them coming to a crashing halt in metal pieces the moment they bump into him. Eventually I realised I needed to get more into character, and found that hurling pipe bombs at them got me through the level much more efficiently. So with some frustrations aside, Manhattan Project is a decently fun game. It's definitely one that I find myself going back to after getting the footage I needed for the video, and it's well placed as the final game in the anthology, being a nice throwback in some ways to the earlier days of Apogee. And that is everything. You have now listened to 2.5 hours or 35,000 words of me talking about the games by Apogee, 3D Realms or occasionally Pinball Wizards. At the time of putting this video together, you can either get the standalone version from 3drealms.com or the Steam version just by searching for it on there. The standalone one gets you the 2 Commander Keen series and Wolfenstein 3D on top of the 29 base games, and the Steam bundle comes with Dark Ages, Xenophage and Balls of Steel. At the moment, my personal recommendation would be for the standalone one, because the games by id Software are well worth having, but either one is worth it to experience either a heap of nostalgia or just a heap of historically significant, competently put together games. 3D Realms' story doesn't end there though, as they were also involved with a number of games after the millennium that weren't in the anthology, either through being licensed to other developers or published on platforms other than their mainstay, the PC. During the late 90s, they branched out into licensing various Duke Nukem games on the PlayStation and N64, some of which were ports of various parts of Duke Nukem 3D, and some entirely new Tomb Raider-style third-person shooters written by N-Space. Another build engine game called Blood also emerged, which had been started by a developer funded by 3D Realms but was then passed to Monolith Entertainment in favour of developing Shadow Warrior. As you might be able to imagine from its name, it used its heavy graphic violence as its main selling point. At the end of 2001, Remedy Entertainment, who had previously worked on Death Rally, released their next project with support from 3D Realms and struck gold with the critically acclaimed Max Payne. This was an action game heavily based around bullet time as The Matrix had just come out, and was also noted for using film noir style storytelling that was unusual for a game of the time. It scooped up a vanload of awards from publications like IGN and GameSpot, and even a BAFTA for Best PC Game of 2001, and so a sequel soon followed. During the rest of the early 2000s, 3D Realms re-released a fair amount of their back catalogue as freeware. A lot of these were very early text-based games that weren't included in this anthology, like Scott Miller's early quiz games, and an interesting looking title called Caves of Thor, similar to Cross. A couple of games from the 90s were also declared freeware, with Biomenace and Alien Carnage among them. Source code releases for Duke Nukem 3D and Shadow Warrior soon followed, allowing independent developers to get their hands on the code that ran these games and to engineer the various source ports from them. Crystal Caves and Secret Agent were also blessed with patches in 2005, a probable world record setting 14 years after their release. These updates corrected a slight issue with running the games under Windows XP, where it was possible for the system clock to be set back 100 years after exiting. Moving forward to 2006, which to put it in context was still nearly 10 years ago, Prey was released for computers in the Xbox 360, with Human Head Studios being credited for the release version after it had been in development in some form or another since 1995. It's a science fiction first-person shooter using id Tech 4, also known as the Doom 3 engine, and follows a Cherokee who I think I would frankly insult by attempting to pronounce after a bar on his Oklahoma reservation is abducted by aliens who consume life from Earth for their sustenance. After looking at Shadow Warrior, I think you'd be forgiven for being very wary of 3D Realms making a game with a Native American protagonist, but according to his actor Michael Greyeyes, they were very receptive to his input and portrayed the character in a much better way than the films that he had had experience with. The game gained favourable reviews and a planned sequel, but it was ultimately aborted. During the rest of the decade, 3D Realms gained a fair amount of infamy for their continued work on the ill-fated Duke Nukem Forever, which had been a concept in various forms since 1998. It was eventually licensed out to Gearbox Software and was finally released in 2011 after becoming the centre of a messy legal tug-of-war. In the meantime, 3D Realms worked on porting some of their games to the mobile market. Both their build engine games and Rise of the Triad came out on iOS, and Duke Nukem 3D also made an appearance on Android. With the release of this anthology, it looks like 3D Realms is undergoing a new beginning. They're now owned by Interceptor Entertainment, an international game company based in Denmark that got its start producing a Duke Nukem fan game that, in keeping with tradition, is currently on hold. Interceptor Entertainment was responsible for the 2013 revival of Rise of the Triad, which I recorded for this channel a while ago, and there was a separate remake of Shadow Warrior developed by a studio called Flying Wild Hog that was released soon afterwards. 3D Realms and Interceptor are currently working on Bombshell, a sort of futuristic Diablo-styled action RPG featuring the adventures of Colonel Shelley Harrison and her mechanical arm of destruction. It's currently scheduled for release at the end of summer 2015. It also looks like a revival of Wacky Wheels is in development by Cascadia Games, although not a whole lot is known about it yet. Whatever happens next, 3D Realms will always have been among my first experiences with games, and their early 90s titles represent a large part of what I enjoy about playing and writing games today. So as I finally end this series, I'd like to extend thanks to Joe Ziegler, Keith Schuler and Jenny Wrights for providing their input on these videos, as well as everyone else at Apogee who made it as legendary as it was, a couple of whom are sadly no longer with us. This has been me stumbling through the 3D Realms Anthology, and now I have a heap of games that I really need to replay.